Let me give you all, so I'm going to give you all a little bit of background. So I'm 23 now, I ran at 21. I turned 22 during the election, October, right before getting elected, so I could barely drink at the socials and things. So my opponents, I ran for school board. It's an at-large, which means the whole city decides, not by district. So my opponents one was a 62-year-old moderate Republican, 12-year incumbent, PhD in geology, kind of random. Another one was a 57-year-old Democrat. Moderate Democrat. He's like a financial banker, so he had a lot of money, or what we would call dark money, because we didn't know where it was coming from. And then the third one was interesting. He was I would say more of a libertarian, but he was a Mormon. So socially that did affect some of his policies, but fiscally he was more on the left side. So in terms of that, I keep mentioning their age because my identity is very important. Because obviously ageism was one of my biggest things. So now I'm a politician, and a lot of people are always talking ill of politicians, and I'm sitting in the back like, this is awkward, And my day job was I was working 2 jobs when I started the election. So I was working as a mechanic at an AutoZone. We talked about working class. In my district, so I'm fixing people's cars and stuff. I wasn't telling them I was running for office, obviously. And then I would go change, put on the suit, and I was the higher ed lobbyist, because we had previously gotten defunded, so I worked less hours for them. So I was also a lobbyist, and I come from organizing, so when I sit in the back of the room and they're talking about lobbyists and politicians, I'm like, oh no, I'm both of them. But in regards to the campaign, I was a student, right, Latino, obviously, so I'm the first Latino elected in my city, and in central Phoenix, that county is Maricopa County. It's got 70–80% of the vote for Arizona. Half of that county, there was no new person of color.
City?
Tempe. Yeah, so no new person of color was elected. The closest thing was a Latino progressive atheist that was incumbent, just to give you kind of an expectation, because it was the lowest turnout since World War II, and that's because everyone was at war that year. For me, election night was obviously great because I won, but I ran as a moderate Democrat, like publicly. I won't say what I am privately, but that's why I recorded. So publicly, I ran as a moderate Democrat, but everyone that was a Democrat basically lost. All the new Democrats lost in Arizona because there was a Republican tidal wave, but it was really due to voter turnout. So if you're a Republican, that was great for you, and if you were a Democrat, no matter what you did, you were dismayed at the voter turnout. So my city, it's about 25–28% Latino, about 12% are registered to vote, about 8% voted last election, and that's for the popular ticket, so you can imagine how many voted for school district. And then when you look at the school district I ran for, it was 65% Latino, so most of these kids' parents didn't vote, and about 10% Black, 10% Native American, which is a big population there, and about 5–10% white. But everyone from the teacher to the superintendent and school board had been white previously, so that was, the racial barriers are obviously big, since we're like post 1070, which is the rule that, that card you and all that, but it's still very much a part of the reality that Latinos live specifically, and I would include Native Americans because it's based on skin color, not on whether you're actually Latino. So for example, when we met at Netroots, I was leading that protest against Arpaio, and that day I was an organizer. I had a lot of hats, different hats. So I'm wearing the bandana and yelling and everything, and it's the regular Arizona folks and then the Netroots folks. But in my pocket I have my regular wallet, which I have right now, right, with my social, with my insurances, with a million IDs that most other people don't need. And then you take it back to old school Germany. It's basically the same thing. And in my car, I always have my passport. But for the protest, I had my passport and my school board ID. Obviously, teachers in my district don't know that I was doing that, but I kept it just in case. So that's kind of the reality of the identity problem there. But most importantly, I think, is that I was young. So I was 40 to 50 years younger than my opposition, and most importantly, I was also new to the city. So I got on the ballot around May, June, so you have to get signatures to get on the ballot at first. then you run your campaign, you win or lose. So first I wanted to see if I could get on the ballot, and I had only lived in that city about 1.5 years. So in Arizona I lived about 4 years, but I was in other parts. So relatively speaking, if you're in politics in Arizona, you're like, where did Patrick come from? You know, because those previous 4 years I was doing student organizing, higher ed policy at the university campuses. So both locally for the Arizona Student Association, which is our SSA, Statewide Student Association, and for the National United States Student Association. So that's like Pell Grants, veteran predatory lending, things like that. So I had all this higher ed policy experience, and that's what I leveraged into running for office. And then my mother teaches English in a high school, and my dad teaches special education. My grandma taught Spanish to natives in Mexico, so it's a big tradition of teaching. And originally, you know, I asked my mom, should I be a teacher? And she said, no, we don't make any money. So I went the route of engineering, and I ended up in Arizona to do engineering. And then I found out how corrupt the corporate commission was, which in my opinion, to give you kind of an example of Arizona politics, is one of the most corrupt elections, because they register your vote, counts by acre. So let's say you live in a house that's a 1/4 acre, you have a 1/4 vote. You have a farm that's 100 acres, you have 100 votes. And no one really knows about the election because it's on a very special date, and it's a public utility, but it's also a company, so they can donate to candidates. So we have SRP, for example. Let's say they come up to me and they give me 100,000, and then I run for their board. So talking about oversight, you know, it's very suspicious. Regardless of ideology, it doesn't matter at that point. And then you throw in Citizens United and things like that. So a big barrier that we talked about yesterday, working class, was that it's about 15,000 to win or run a competitive campaign in my city for a school district. Mind you, it doesn't pay. So you're working class, you're putting up 15,000 to not get paid. And I ran a very unorthodox campaign, and because I could not afford the 15,000. That was my first question. Can I 15,000? That's like how much I'm making a year. You know, I have to eat and pay rent too. Because again, we had just gotten defunded, so the previous person that had my lobbying job made 2-3 times what I did. So outside of that, I spent about $5,000-6,000, and half of that came directly from my paycheck. So a lot of it was knowing your why is very important, coming from organizing, because or else you won't have the motivation to fight through things like that, unless you're already, you know, upper middle class and you can do that. Traditionally, social change has come from upper middle class and others. Think of, you know, revolutionary founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of my campaign, again, I was giving half my paycheck. The other half was coming from family. Being Latino, I used to say, you know, I don't have a cousin with $1 million, but I have 1 million cousins with $1, so I can do that. But to give kind of an idea of my schedule in terms of work ethic, 7 a.m. to 12 p.m., Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I was running my campaign. 12 to 4, I call that my living time. That's when I would eat and do homework every now and then. And find a house, because I was looking for a house at the time. And then Tuesday, Thursday, 7 to 12, I would go to school. About 16, 18 credit hours, so full school. So when people tell me I'm busy, it's like, no. But so those Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, I was doing a statewide voter drive under the Student Association. So I was running around the state of Arizona registering voters on all the campuses, and then 12 to 4 living. And mind you, if I travel to Tucson or Flagstaff, those 4 hours are used to commute, so they're not really there. And then 4 to 8, Monday through Friday, I had my paid canvassing team, because again, I ran as a moderate Democrat, but it's a nonpartisan position. But both parties weren't going to support me, right, because I'm a brand new guy. And again, I just moved to the city, so they're like, who's this? You know, he's challenging establishment. Because the Republicans, the way they did it is they fought with their money to see who wins the primary, and then you run. The Democrats, you know, you wait 20 years, volunteer, and then you run. So both are not very well, you know, so let's say you're an actual independent, you have no chance. So if you're a new Republican or a new Democrat, you have to go one of those routes, traditionally. So I was untraditional. So I had to get paid canvassers, and at the time Obama was talking about the 10 for 10, $10 with 10 cents minimum wage. So I paid that. And again, working class, it's like really hard to pay that, right? So I hired about 4 to 6 people. That's where the fundraising comes in. So there was, yesterday I was talking to Nick about this, in terms of working class. I was paying my main field manager, so I was my campaign manager, because I was like, I know what I'm doing. But for a larger campaign, I can't do that because I have to be at events and things. But for my second in command, my field manager, he was a moderate Republican, but he was a great worker and a friend, so I hired him. I was like, you're great. But one month, I remember I paid him more than I got paid that month, and I was like, can we switch checks? So 4 to 8, that was every day, paid canvassing. And half of the people I hired were friends I knew needed jobs, and the other half had been homeless folks, because I had previously worked for HRC, Human Rights Campaign. That was my first job in Arizona. And there was a homeless man that came up to me and said, "Are you hiring?" And I was like, "Yeah, come tomorrow. I'll train you." And he shows up tomorrow, and then we trained him. This was Thursday, and then we go out to eat, and he says, "I'm fasting," and I'm like, "Okay." And he's like, "Because I don't have money," and I'm like, "That's not fasting." So then we bought him food, and luckily that Friday we got paid, so it was enough. And now he's at a community college, just from him coming up and talking to me briefly.
There's some people I think standing.
Should I?
I don't know the rock. What does that?
I just had a question to ask one person. Camera stand?
I left it in there for them. It's in the main room.
Okay.
That's actually really cool.
And somebody took it on
That's
So
right.
it's,
Homeless,
to the room to
homeless,
take.
That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the stuff that I joke with my friends that I don't put on Facebook, So that's because that's the personal stuff. I didn't, take pictures with them. Look, I hired homeless people.
Right.
Because for coming from organizing, that's wrong.
Right.
So like you go to a protest for Black Lives Matter, I'm
Mhm.
Latino, I'm in the front, that's wrong. I go to a community that's lower class white folks and I'm helping them organize. I can't go to them. Those are the unsaid rules, because then I'm going in and telling them what to do. And then I apply that to politics. So that was 4 to 8 p.m. 8 to 9 p.m. There was a legislative district 26, so that's half of my city. I would work with them 8 to 9 p.m. And then 9 to 10 I would work with the southern part, which was another legislative district, but my school district's in both. So I worked with both offices. So one was older, middle class, upper middle class, and they had all the food, so I would eat there, save money. And then the northern one had like beer donations, candy, because it was like the younger, more progressive, so I would eat there too. And when one said, "Are you giving us money for ink?" then I would run to the other one in terms of unorthodox stuff. And then 10 to 12, so this is midnight, I would have my good close friends that were willing to volunteer and drive. At this point, we're not knocking and talking to people, we're just dropping lit for name recognition. And then they would quit on me at midnight, amateurs. And then 12 to 2, I would go by myself. So December after the election, November 4th, right? My car broke down because I was driving so much, which I'm still paying off. And those are the costs of the working class, because if I was upper middle class, most of them just rent cars. They rent little Mazda 2s or something, or hire teams of people to do that. So after that, remember I'm still a student, I'm still doing statewide voter drive. So I would go home, and typically I would fight with my girlfriend about not being home for a little bit, and then I would do my homework, and then wake up the next day at 6 or 7 and do it all over again. And this was definitely August through October, because the summer period was canvassing to get on the ballot. And remember, Arizona gets to 120 degrees. So in terms of fighting incumbents, you're getting people that you don't really know. That's why, again, I hired people, because I wasn't going to recruit people, "Hey, let's go march in the sun for 120 degrees to get my signatures." It just wasn't there. So again, you have to believe in your why. So I believe a lot in what I call the ego of the organizer. That comes from like Saul Alinsky. He's a nice guy. The organizer, because it's not egotistical, but it's remembering why you're doing it and being grounded in that. Is it one?
Yeah.
Oh, are you just taking selfies with me?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the ego of the organizer is important, because again, no one's gonna bet on you the first time. So you don't want to go home and cry every day. So you got to remember why you're doing it. So part of my district, mine is 80-90% the city of Tempe, but that other percentage is the township of Guadalupe, which is about half Native American, half Latino immigrant. But part of it is in my district. So for me, a big thing was running as a radical to challenge the status quo, not necessarily as a politician trying to win. So if I lost, I felt fine and I felt safe. in the fact that a Latino kid in that town specifically, for the first time, saw a Latino last name. So then they might be president and change the world, and I might lose. That's fine. But if I was a politician and I lost, then I would go home and drink or whatever. So actually, right after the election, I heard the guy that ran for governor as a Democrat did that. So and I was like, okay, so he was running as a politician, and you're willing to do much more. So again, youth being one of my weaknesses, I did what we call a SWOT analysis. So I put an analysis on the wall of my weaknesses. And I was like, how do I fix my youth? What do I do? I can't look older. I can try that, but it's 120 degrees. I can't wear a suit. So one of the big things I did is that schedule. I didn't have to sleep. My opponents, one of them, the one at 62, he told me later that he would go to sleep at 7 or 8. They didn't expect me to run a campaign. And running on the left, it was interesting because, for example, things like getting yard signs, I have to get union signs. If I was on the right, I don't have to. So on the left, I have to because you pro-union, etc. But that's more expensive. So if you're working class, it's harder to do that. So one of the tricks lately I've heard is labor delivered. So that means basically you made it at home, So that's the only good alternative to not doing union. So one of the things I did, and this goes into the details of the minutia of being trained to run for office. So instead of getting multiple colors, I got one color on white, so technically it's 2 colors. I was the only one to use blue because everyone was scared. So a lot of the Democrats use red and yellow to trick independents and Republicans. And then I didn't print on it, so we went from $4 to like $1, $2 per sign because I used a sticker, but then it didn't last as long. So then I couldn't afford to have it, little details like that. And in terms of knowing more of the details, the finances were like very, very confusing to me because I come from organizing, not from finances. So I had a ton of fines from the state, and I told people after election day that the state is the one that won because if you're a new Republican or a new Democrat, you have no idea what you're doing. And I paid them like $700 in fines. Out of those 5,000, it's a hefty. But once I figured it out, I used it as a strategy. So like in October, I filed late on purpose. My opponents saw my finances and they're like, oh, he didn't spend anything. But secretly, I had already spent everything, and then I paid my fine, and I had signs way earlier than they did. So again, doing that. And then one of them started buying things, and he was running on the right, and he was using dark money, so his signs didn't say where they're coming from. And I was like, oh, damn, because he had the same amount, but he didn't have to report any where they came from. It's just personal. So that's kind of why identity is really important in that. So I also wanted to include touching on power. So running as a radical was to challenge the status quo and build power, specifically for Latinos and for younger folks, but largely for people of color in the East Valley of what is Maricopa. And it was important to leverage privilege in that. So a lot of folks talk about privilege, but not about leveraging it. So working within the Latino community there, 80-90% of the organizers are undocumented. So for my friends that are saying, I'm undocumented, unafraid, I'm like in the back like, wait, I have citizenship, how do I fit in? So what I could do is run for office, out of my 12,000 kids from my school district, about 2,000-3,000 are undocumented. And if they see a Latino school board member, that changes their perception. Because during 1070, sheriffs were going into the schools and carding kids and calling parents and saying, hey, your kid, was working bad or something like that, and the parent would come to pick up the kid and then be carded, essentially, and then picked up from there. So, and these are the stories that exist a lot in Arizona. Like I've had a lot of kids I'm mentoring that their mother was on the way to pick them up and then she never came back. And this is 1070 was 2010, yeah. So, and this is 5-6 years ago. And that directly ties into the problem we have in Arizona with private prisons, which is one of my, that would say, that's my biggest opposition in terms of higher ed stuff. Because they're not just cutting our funding to save money, they're reappropriating it completely to private prisons. So that's something. And another thing that I learned is what I call like hats versus masks. So as a politician, everyone's like, oh, you're wearing a mask, you're not being yourself. Good note to end on. But a big thing was seeing them more as hats. So, for example, when you met me at Netroots, right? We met at a pool party. So around 4 p.m., there was a fancy fundraiser for a state legislator. Then as a politician, I go to that, etc. Then I went to the parking lot, changed into my bathing suit for a pool party fundraiser thing for another nonprofit. Then I went back to my car, changed back into the suit, then went to a legislative committee fundraiser. Then I came back, changed into the bathing suit. And that's happened multiple times. So my friends that are organizers might see me in a suit one day and they're like, that's sold out, politician that I told you. And then I'll show up to the politicians, they're like, isn't that the guy we saw on TV protesting? So they're like that radical, and that's where the age also plays in. So we have a lot of banquets, rubber chicken dinners, I call them. So a lot of the servers are people of color that are college students that are my age. And everyone I'm sitting with is 60-year-old, mostly old, white, retired men. So it's a little awkward in terms of power dynamics and things like that. Definitely within my family, where my mom's a teacher and I'm like in charge of 2,000 teachers. Because I'm like, you don't know what you're doing, So really knowing how to manipulate that is very important. So in things like me moving forward, I'm working on creating a new nonprofit. I don't necessarily want to go too fast because, again, the Student Association got defunded because it was a legal entity. So if it's not a legal entity, it can't be defunded. So this is, it would be based on policy and direct action, the way I organize. And I think I told you, it would be called Liberation Project, around the idea that liberation isn't tied to citizenship. So especially coming out of the undocumented movement, where a lot of undocumented folks get citizenship and they're like, why am I still being pulled over every day? Like myself. I've been pulled over a block from my house multiple times when the officers' kids go to my schools, and it's a little awkward. Because I give them my school board ID first, and they're like, oh,
Yeah.
it's a little weird. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement, you have full citizenship, but you're being gunned down in the streets, so it doesn't matter. So the idea of liberation. And electoral work is kind of the third branch of what I do, but I wouldn't tie that in because it brings good grant funding and things like that, but it ties your hands a lot because you're doing voter registration often. So for example, last Wednesday I had a school board meeting. It ended at 9 p.m. Then our wonderful state legislature had a special session to pay a lawsuit for education, but they paid half of it, which they made up that rule. So I went straight to the state legislature, found out as the higher ed lobbyist what's going on, because I'm also on the K through 12 legislative team for the school boards. And then the next day I went and sat in committee for 5-6 hours and gave testimony and did all the lobbying stuff, but as a politician now. So before I went to the Capitol and said, hi, I represent 540,000 students. So my personal goal by January was to say, hi, I'm Patrick, and they're like, oh, okay. So half of them like me, the other half not necessarily. I won't say which ones, you can imagine. So that day at noon, remember I'm still a student, so then I drive 40 miles out to go to my campus and go to class. And then my teacher is a Republican state rep. And he comes up to me and he's like, oh, I saw you on TV. And he's laughing because he knows that I don't like the plan. And I'm like, oh, okay. But I'm in class in a suit, and I like, again, putting on the hat of the student. So I'm in casual clothes, and all the students are like, why are you so dressed up? And I'm like, oh, I had a thing, but I don't give it away. And I'm not going to talk in full honesty because I need him as a politician later when I'm trying to save education. So I need him to see me as a lobbyist, not as a student, in terms of power relationships. So then right after that, there was an action at a Tempe hotel where the workers are being maltreated in terms of work they do, finances, sexual harassment, et cetera, et cetera. So there I was on the picket line at this point, and I changed into the protesting outfit. It was like black with white, Day of the Dead kind of stuff. And then that night we shut down a street in my city, and people that I would consider kind of my equals, the ones on city council and stuff, they're giving speeches and stuff, and they didn't recognize me because I'm wearing face paint, the Calavera face paint. And then I go and I shut down the street with 11 people, and there's about 400, and they're doing a big square. And I'm sitting in the middle because I believe in labor rights, and when I believe in labor rights, I don't go up and give a speech. Because I could do that, but it's more important to be in the middle of the street blocking it. So I'm doing that. Meanwhile, the police department is warning that if we don't move, we're going to get arrested. They told me not to share the story, but I'm going to share it. So then I'm sitting there, and then it's the final warning, and they're about to arrest me, and I'm like, oh, I should not be doing this. And every mentor that's political, you know, even the ones on the far left or the pro-union, they were saying, you know, save your arrest for later. But again, these are constituents. These ladies have kids in my school district. If I was one of those ladies, I would be super, you know, excited that a school board member is getting arrested for me. I asked my mom if she had ever seen a school board member, and she's like, no. You know, and I've had teachers that say I've worked for 29 years and never seen a school board member. And I was like, I'm gonna take that as a compliment, you know, and they're like, you should. Because part of it is actually just showing up. Because so many times, you know, these politicians stay just at the galas and things like that. And you can get sucked into that. That's where the ego comes in versus egotistical. So then after that, I got arrested, and then, so last Thursday, this is right after the education stuff, I haven't slept for like a day and a half because of the budget cuts. So Thursday, I'm in prison, and then Friday, my family is visiting, and they have no idea. I didn't want to give them a heart attack. So the next day, I find out that on the drive from Arizona to California, it's about 6 hours, my dad gets a call from my aunt in Mexico, and she's like, is Patrick getting arrested? Is he in jail? And my dad's, you know, very nonchalant. He's like, I don't know. And then they get here, and I was already out of jail by that time because the union had organized it and everything. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got arrested. And obviously they understand why I did it. They support that, but they don't support me getting arrested. It's very different. Yeah, and then I come to my school board meeting this next Wednesday, and the superintendent calls me over because she found out it was on the news and stuff. And I didn't ask. I should have asked. I'm in charge, but just to check with the lawyers and stuff if we don't have a school board policy against that. So she calls me over and she's like, I like what you did, but you shouldn't do it as a school board member. And I'm like, debatable. You know, so like when I was taking my mugshot, I'm like smiling because it was great. I was like, because I haven't gotten arrested since getting into office. So previously I had done it for higher education stuff at the federal level. In terms of the school to prison pipeline. So we're wearing like the gown and we're getting arrested. So that ties into the personal touch of running for office is very important. Because those connections will affect your life, you know. Again, my main campaign guy had opposite views of me, and every now and then he would stop me and say, you know, slow down, slow down. Because I was getting in his face about like, you know, policies, and he wasn't necessarily very political. So at the national level, this particular instance when I got arrested, there's this Senator Bernie Sanders, he walks out. He's just nonchalant. He was in session and we're outside getting arrested. He walks out and he's like, what's this all about? And we're like, free education. And it's like, okay, that sounds like a plan. And then he proposes it within the next 2 weeks. And I'm like, oh, okay, nice guy. And then about 3 years before that, I went to DC for the first time. Before that. Well, when Hillary was Secretary of State. And I'm there with a bunch of kids. We're very excited, you know. And she walks by and we're like, oh my gosh, that's Hillary Clinton. And she's surrounded by Secret Service, and we're waving, and she looks at us, like scoffs, and gets in her car. So just in terms of personal stuff, I was like, you know, Bernie's such a nice guy. You know, at this point, I didn't know anything about their policies. But that personal connection is super important, because the next day after that arrest, I was at some other thing, and they were like, did you get arrested? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, okay, you know, we like that. And this is the organizer community. It's a Latino nonprofit. It's pretty radical that does most of this stuff against Arpaio. But they had like a 4-hour event, and in between there was a Planned Parenthood fundraiser. So I went and I put on like a tux and went to that. And then I came back and put on like the Latino Day of the Dead stuff. And it was important to show support for both communities, because again, they've never seen politicians, let alone, you know, local ones. If I'm not, you know, holding a baby or something. So in terms of the hats, that was very interesting how that affected me personally, because the first time I went to this nonprofit, I obviously believe in like moving between different political universes and affecting change. So on my free time, I created the Brown Berets of Arizona, the new version. So that's akin to the Black Panthers. So while the Black Panthers were in Oakland, the Brown Berets were in LA. The only difference was the Brown Berets were completely nonviolent and with no weapons. So I created it, and most of them are 19, 18 to 21. And when I walked in the first time to organize them, again, they had asked me, so I didn't show up and like, hey, let me fix you. So one is wearing like an ankle bracelet, you know, there's gunshots outside. So it was hard for me as an organizer to learn this new type of organizing. So I showed up to this nonprofit the first time, and I'm wearing casual clothes. I call it my Cesar Chavez outfit. So rolled up sleeves, like kind of square shirt, and jeans, you know, things like that. And brown, because brown is the liberal outfit. black is the conservative outfit. And these are the little things that I had to teach myself, because political science classes aren't going to teach you that. Unless professors, have ran for office, but then they wouldn't be in the classroom. I mean that in a nice way. Okay, yeah, I would rather be in the classroom though. So after that, I walked in my outfit, but I'm wearing the brown beret. But I only wore that in case there was other politicians or people that weren't okay with that. So I would just hide it, So I walk in, but behind me are like 19 to 21-year-olds in full militia outfits for this fundraiser. But it's like Chicano folklore, and this is the most progressive Chicano organization. So obviously they're down with the cause, and it's imagine you're having like a Black Lives Matter movement meeting, and then some Black Panthers walk in. Some of the old ones, like not the new ones, because the new ones there's like 3 different types, and some of them are weird. But they walk in, and you're like, oh, of course we're gonna respect you. So I walk in with that, and they're all kind of looking at me. And then the doors open. It was like a movie scene, and then like 15 of them walk in behind me in full, gear. And this progressive leader from this big pack comes up to me, and he's like, "Are you an honorary member?" And I'm like, "I'm kind of in charge." And then like 2 days before that, I had gone to a different Latino nonprofit, same kind of work, and I showed up in a suit, and they're all like, they were very standoffish. They're like, "Who's this guy? What does he want? Does he want to take pictures or use us?" And I'm like, "No, I'm just here as an organizer. I happen to be wearing a suit. I'm sorry." But that was very key to learning, how to shift between one and the other, because in terms of power relationships, when I show up to the Arpaio protest, so the people that put that together, obviously they respected me as an individual to lead the march because of the work I had done previously, and meanwhile I have other organizing communities that I've worked with. So for example, we had Nation of Islam allies there in regular clothes. And they come up to me and they say hello and everything. Meanwhile, Latinos come up to me and they're like, "Why are those people here?" And I'm like, "Well, we need each other." So a lot of the trend the last year in Phoenix has been, we've had protests against police by mostly the black community, and protests against the sheriff, mostly the Latino community, and both don't help each other. And I'm like, and within the elected official community, it's even worse. So we have about 90 state representatives and senators total, and we have 1 black state rep. Statistically, we should have 7 or 8. So that's a huge problem, So I'll be working on his campaign just for that purpose, to build those relationships, because of the opposition we've had from the right, and just the majority. But that's kind of that. But I want to leave more room open to questions.